on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Verse 16 says, Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Then Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone that he had put at his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of the city had been Luz previously. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me, and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give you a tenth. How many times is God right there with us and we do not realize it? Here Jacob is running away from his angry brother. Remember the story. He had lied and cheated and stolen his father's blessing. Right? He wasn't the firstborn. His father had told Esau, the firstborn, Go catch me game, prepare a meal so that I may bless you before I die. And Jacob, at the bequest of his mother, lies and cheats and steals the blessing. And so he's running. His brother wants to kill him. His father's probably not too happy with him. His mother's scared for his life. And so he's running away to his uncle's house. And God is right there with him. I want us to look at what God says to him in verse 15. Before this, God essentially blesses him with the same blessing that his grandfather Isaac had received and that his father Isaac had been blessed with, right? This land will be your land. Your descendants will be blessed. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed. Right? We've heard this before. If you've been coming this year, we've heard this blessing before because it's the same blessing that God had spoken over Abraham multiple times, and it's the same blessing God had spoken over Isaac, his father. So God speaks this blessing over Jacob as well, determining that Jacob truly would be the one that God would bless the descendants and ultimately the nations of the earth. Every people group would be blessed through his seed. And then we get to verse 15, and God reassures Jacob. He says, Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Think about this. Jacob was not the wilderness man. That was his brother Esau, right? Jacob was mild. He dwelt in tents. We know from the story the week before last, he's a grown man, and his mom is still kind of telling him what to do, and he's doing it, right? And so his brother, on the other hand, was the rugged one. He was the hunter. He was the gatherer. He was the one that took care of the fields. And Jacob dwelt in tents. So I imagine that on his journey from where he was in Beersheba to Haran, which was in north of Syria, so he's in Israel, modern day Israel, in Beersheba, to Haran, which is actually in Turkey, in our modern countries, geographically. This is 900 kilometers away. That's 560 miles. 560 miles today is a good long trip. Right? 560 miles is a decent day's drive in a car at 65 miles an hour. I know, because that's about how far it is to Tulsa, and I go there often. Right? It's a decent trip. Imagine in ancient times, not the wilderness man, the mild man who dwells in tents is on a journey of 560 miles. Now, I'm not sure if he was walking or riding a donkey, but either way, that would have been a long journey, right? Would have been a long trip. I'm not sure if he's ever made this trip before or not. The Bible doesn't tell us. What I do know is he was alone. He had no traveling companions. His mom wasn't going with him. His dad definitely wasn't going with him. And his brother, who would have probably been the protector for sure, is not going with him. He's all by himself. And so God comes in a dream. We don't know if this is the first night of the journey, but I imagine it might have been. And God reassures him, I am with you. How much confidence would have been built in Jacob hearing these three words? I am with you. 4. I can't count this morning. I am with you. Remember, he's all alone. He's left his father's house. He's left his mother's tent. And God comes in a dream and he reassures Jacob that I am with you. And he says, and will keep you wherever you go. Jacob was on a long journey. He was going to a land far, far away. And God reassures him with these words that he will keep him wherever he goes. And he had just blessed him with the same blessing that he would inherit this land. And he says that he will bring him back to this land. I could imagine Jacob thinking when he left his mother's house and his father's house, am I ever coming back? My brother is literally ready to take my head off. And he would have, right? Esau was the wild, crazy one who would have probably killed his brother given the opportunity at this time. He was that angry. He was that upset. And Jacob is probably thinking, will I ever come home? Will I ever be able to embrace my mother again? Will I ever be able to see my father again? Will I ever be able to come back to the place that I've grown up, that I've known my entire life? Will I ever come back home? And God reassures him and says, I will bring you back to this land. For a young man that's running away, this would have built confidence in him. This would have reassured him on his journey. And then he concludes with this at the end of the verse, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. I don't believe that this means that God was going to leave him and abandon him and leave him hanging once everything happened. No. I think this is giving Jacob confidence until you see the fulfillment of every single one of these things that I have spoken to you. Know that I am with you. Know that I am with you. Did you know that we can be assured of the very same thing? That God is not going to leave you. He's not going to forsake you. That He will be with you wherever you go. Now, you might not be going on a 560-mile trip on foot or on horseback, but know this, God is with you wherever you go. Whatever you go through, God is with you. We can rest assured, we can have confidence that God is with us. Sometimes it might not feel like it, but God is right there with you. My question is, will you turn to Him and ask Him for help? You see, God never leaves us, God never forsakes us, but oftentimes we forget about God. Or we call upon Him only when we're in desperate moments. We know He's there, we know that He can be called upon, but we wait until the last possible moment to call upon Him, right? Will you turn to Him and ask Him for help? Jacob, when he wakes up, he realizes how awesome of an experience he had just had, and he names this place Bethel, the house of God. And listen to his vow, his response to God's promises. This is, again, Genesis 28, verses 20 through 22. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me. Did God say that He would be with him? Is God a liar? So this was going to take place, right? But Isaac, or Jacob here, Jacob says, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going. Is that what God had just said, that He would keep him? Yes. And give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my father's house in peace. Did He say that He would come back? Yes. Right? God said this. Jacob's like, if you do this, what you just said you would do. If you do what you said you do, we're going to get to the promise here, the vow here. If you'll be with me, if you'll keep me, if you'll bring me back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set as a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that you do this yourself. There's a point that we simply believe and walk in faith that what God said He would do, He's going to do. Right? We don't have to make a vow, a conditional vow. God, if you do this, I'll do this. If you do that, I'll do that. No, if God has told us that He would do something, we can be assured and confident that He will. Right? But Jacob here is making a vow to God, if you do what you just told me you would do, this is going to be my response. This pillar will be a house of God. And all that you give me, I will give a tenth to you. We saw this take place with Abraham and Melchizedek. We talked about that several months ago. That Abraham gave a tenth, he gave a tithe of the spoils to Melchizedek, the high priest of God. Jacob here says, I'll give a tithe, I'll give a tenth of everything that you bless me with. I'll give back to you, God. I don't give, personally, me, I don't give because God blesses me. I give because God is faithful. right? He is worthy. Whether I receive another blessing from God my entire life or not, I'm still going to tithe. I'm still going to give. Why? Because He gave everything to me. He gave literally His only begotten Son for me. Jesus gave His life for me, and therefore He is worthy of so much more than a tenth. How many would agree? Right? He is so much more worthy than just a tenth of the increase that He gives me. But that's the starting place, right? This is where Abraham started. This is where Jacob started. This is where the law says that we should start, is we start with a tenth. Giving it back to God, acknowledging that God is my source. God is my source. He is the source of all of our increase, is He not? Now you might say, but I worked hard for this paycheck or this retirement payment. Well, yeah, you did. Maybe. Right? Let's assume you did. You worked hard, whether to earn the paycheck or you've put in your time, you've invested well, you've got retirement money coming. Whatever the case may be, you worked hard. But who gave you the gifts, the talents, the abilities to work hard? Who gave you that creative idea to gain wealth? Who gave you the creativity to do what you're doing that now makes you money? Who gave you those abilities? God, right? So even though we're the ones that put in the time, we're the ones that put in the effort, we're the ones that work, God ultimately is the one that is the source of our ability to do all of these things. And so He is the source of all of our increase. So what have you committed to give back to God? Jacob committed a tenth of all of his increase. What have you committed to give to the Lord? God said He would not abandon Jacob, that He would be with him, that He would keep him, that He would bring him home. In Deuteronomy 31:6, it says, "Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you, nor forsake you." This is such a confidence-building verse for us, that God will never leave us, and He will never forsake us. If you don't have this one memorized, if you don't have this one highlighted or marked down in your Bible, I recommend that you do so. That you bookmark this one. That God will never leave you and He will never forsake you. We're going to skip ahead about 20 years and a couple of chapters here to Genesis 31. Genesis 31, we're going to start in verse 2 here. Because we're looking at the blessing of God on Jacob. As he was leaving his father's house, he has a dream, and we see this dream. We see the blessing of God. God says, "I will be with you, I will keep you, and I will bring you back home." Jacob's response was he would build a house of God in Bethel, and He would give him a tenth. 20 years later, in Genesis 31:2, it says, "And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban," that was his father-in-law, "and indeed it was not favorable toward him as before." We're going to circle back to that thought. "Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you.' So Jacob sent, and he called Rachel and Leah," those were his two wives, "to the field to his flock. And he said to them, 'I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable toward me as before. But the God of my father has been with me. Isn't that what God said he would do? He'd be with him until everything was fulfilled. The God of my father has been with me, and you know that with all my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me. What goes around comes around, right? And changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. I believe that there are times that God uses our situations, our surroundings, our circumstances to prepare us for the next season. I remember before I left the bank to come on full-time here at the church, I had been in banking almost 10 years at the time, and I really did enjoy what I was doing. I had changed banks about 2 years previously, and dream job, dream opportunities, loved the people I worked with, the opportunities I had, and I really enjoyed what I was doing. But I had been interim here about a year and a half almost at that time, and doing both full-time at the church and full-time at the bank is a lot when you've got little kids and a wife that wants to spend time with you as well. And I noticed that at work, things were frustrating me a lot more than normal. That I do not stress very easily. I'm a pretty quiet, mild-mannered guy most of the time. And I really just don't stress. And so I remember in the weeks and months leading up to me coming full-time here, at the bank, man, stuff was just stressing me out, situations, customers, things I was working on, just stressing me out, getting under my skin when, I would never get irritated before. I was getting irritated almost daily, and still love and appreciate the people I worked with, but I noticed that the grace to do what I had done for a season was lifting. It was lifting. And I believe that God allows the grace to do what you have done to lift when it's time for a change of seasons. How many of you have ever recognized this in your life? That the grace to be somewhere, the grace to do something, begins to lift when God is preparing to move us seasons. Now, I don't believe at all that God causes bad things to happen to you so that you know it's time to change jobs or careers or schools or locations. But I do believe that the grace to endure certain things lifts when it's time to move forward. Right? Jacob recognized that his father-in-law's countenance toward him had changed for the worse, not the better. And while Laban doesn't really sound like the most stand-up guy to begin with, if his countenance had gotten worse, and Jacob considered it favorable to have had his wages changed 10 times, it was definitely time to leave. Right? Here's the guy that changed his wages 10 times, swapped wives, committed to him after working for 7 years. You can go read that story on your own time, right? On his wedding night, Jacob was supposed to marry Rachel, and Laban gave him Leah instead, after working 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. He changed his wages 9 more times, right? Because that was 1 of 10 over a 20-year period. If that is what Jacob considered favorable, if his countenance is now unfavorable, Jacob's like, man, it's time to go, right? The grace to be here is gone. It's time to move on. And God comes and he tells him it's time to go home. So God speaks to him while at the same time, the natural situation in which he is in is changing, right? How many of us, the same tends to happen? Our natural situation is adjusting or changing or becoming unfavorable for us. And at the same time, we feel God speaking to us, it's time to change. Now, sometimes we need to endure a difficult season. Sometimes life is just hard. Sometimes your coworker just doesn't like you. And God gives you the grace to endure that season. Other times, God is speaking to you, and your situation is agreeing with what God is speaking to you, and it's signs all around telling you it's time to move forward. And this is what takes place here. Jacob tells his wives that God was with him the entire time. That no matter how many times Laban changed his wages, right? Bait and switched him, made it more difficult to earn a living or to increase. I remember when my dad changed employment. He had been in the cooking industry for almost 20 years and was just done with it, burnt out on it. And he went to work doing cable installation. This was back in Tulsa. And he did cable installation for a couple years as an independent contractor. And my dad is a workaholic, and he worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week in the restaurants. And so working 12-hour days was nothing unusual for my dad. And so he went to do cable installation. He was an independent contractor, so no overtime laws at all. He could work 16 hours a day if he felt like it, and sometimes he did. And so at the time, he was paid like for every single little thing he did. So if he went to install new service and they had 3 digital boxes and HBO and, the local networks and all of these, so I don't know if you know this, I know this because my dad did this, on cable, they have little filters that they literally screwed into the cable line 20 years ago, that filtered out each channel block. And so every filter he put on or took off, he got paid for. Every box he set up, every run line he ran in a house, if he was running line to a basement, he got paid for that. If he ran a line to the attic, he got paid for that. If he ran a line in this bedroom and the living room, he got paid for every single little thing he did. And so he made really good money because he worked long hours and he was kind of good at what he did. Well, then they changed how they were paying him because they figured out, man, some of these independent contractors can knock out like 20 jobs in a day and we're paying them hundreds upon hundreds of dollars and we're not making the profit. And so the company he was working for changed how they were paying him. And because he worked long hours, he still made okay money. But over the year or 2 or 3 that he did this, they kept doing the exact same thing. They changed it and changed it and changed it, where finally he's like, man, I can't make any money. Because they've cut it down so much, how much they paid him or how they paid him. This is exactly what happened to Jacob, right? Laban kept changing how he got paid or what he got paid or what his wages would be. And I'm sure that each time it was not more favorable, right? It's less favorable, right? He's not getting raises, he's getting more difficult increases here. But through all of this, God did not allow Laban to hurt him. Romans 8:28, we talked about this on Wednesday night. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purposes. Jacob was called by God and blessed by God. So God made everything work for his good. No matter what Laban decided, no matter what he said his wages would be and then changed it on him again and again, God worked it together for his good. Genesis 31 verse 11 says, "Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream saying, 'Jacob.' And I said, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Lift your eyes now and see, all the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray spotted. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your family.'" 20 years later, God reminds Jacob of his vow. God reminds Jacob, "Hey, remember that stone you laid on? Hey, remember you turned it into a pillar and you anointed it? Remember that vow you made to me, that promise you made to me so many years ago? It's time to go home. It's time to go back to the land of your family." Because remember, God had promised the land to Jacob and to his descendants. And so there would be a time that he would need to go home. And God says, this is the time. Now is the time. God reminds Jacob of his vow. He brings back to his remembrance everything that he had said and everything that he had done. And it's time to go home. One thing I think about is this: Jacob knew God was with him. But he also knew that his brother Esau was probably still waiting on him to return. And while time might heal some wounds, others not so much, right? Depending on the person, time can be your friend, or time can be a festering moment. Or in Jacob's case, 2 decades. Genesis 32, verse 9. Jacob's on his way home. He's praying to God. He's crying out to God. Jacob says, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you.' I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become 2 companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." You see, Jacob had sent some servants on ahead to Esau to prepare him for his arrival, right? He didn't want to just show up and find out that Esau's still got his sword sharpened and ready to take his head off, right? He wants to feel it out and see what the situation is at home. And so his servant goes to Esau and he says, "Jacob is coming home. He's on his way with his family and his livestock and everything that he has." And the servant returns and said, "Hey, your brother Esau's on his way to meet you. And he's bringing 400 men with him." I don't know about you, but a 400-man posse as the welcoming party doesn't sound good for the guy that the last thing you heard was, "I'll take your head off," right? At least that's what Jacob is thinking, is this isn't good. This is bad news. And so you can read the story. Jacob sends hundreds, literally hundreds of animals as gifts, one group after the other group after the other group, thinking I'll bribe my brother into not killing me, right? If I give him enough stuff, he won't take my head off. He'll let me live. And so Jacob does this. He sends all of these gifts, all these animals on ahead of him. And he sends his wives and his children across the river, and he lays down again to sleep. We pick up the story in Genesis 32:24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. Now when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip. And the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with God and with men, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is it that you ask about my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Just as he crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. You can read the rest of the story in chapter 33. Esau comes to meet him, and he greets him warmly. He offers to help him, but Jacob, still a little nervous about his intentions, says, "No, I've got it. You know, the kids, they're slow. The wives have been on this long journey, albeit it was a long journey. The cattle, the sheep, we've just traveled 560 miles. We'll just go at our own pace. You can go on home. It's okay." And so Esau returns home. And Jacob returns to his father's house and to his land. God was faithful. God was faithful. Even though Jacob had wrestled with God and he had wrestled with men, even though he had struggled with his father-in-law, even though he had struggled with the people that he was around, God was faithful.